This is the 82nd Airborne Division, fearless among fighting units.
Nearby!
From Fort Bragg, home of the airborne and the center of the military universe, this is the All-American Legacy Podcast.
Go!
An inside look at the 100-year history of the 82nd.
They are all American, all the way.
Welcome back to the All-American Legacy Podcast. Once again, this is Joe Bacino, and once again, I am joined by our two historian friends, Dr. Phil Nash and Dr. Joe Coohill.
Phil Nash here. Thanks. Great to be here.
Yeah, Joe Coohill here. It's wonderful to be on this show to talk about stuff that's so important and to the veterans of the same division in subject matter we're talking about.
And what is the subject matter we're talking about today?
That would be Alvin York, and I'm assuming by far the most famous veteran of the 82nd Division who's not a paratrooper.
Easily.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, that's what a lot of people don't realize, of course, before planes were very common, you were a ground-based division.
Right.
That's right.
Right. So,
yeah,
Alvin York...
Alvin York is, of course, more famously known as Sergeant York.
Sergeant York.
Although he was a corporal at the time, he did all of his...
That's right, yeah.
Work that got him such fame.
Yeah, and aside from Jim Gavin, I think he's probably the most globally recognized member of the 82nd Division in our history. And his story becomes controversial. We did 2 episodes on this, on his entire life story, and I think we never really, even in 2 episodes, they were longer episodes, we never really got into the full scope of the controversy surrounding his story, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. So let's just start with the Sergeant Alvin York story in general.
Okay, well, I guess I'll start. He is born in 1887 in Pall Mall, Tennessee. I had to look this up. This is Fentress County. I don't know how to pronounce it. Sort of north central Tennessee on the Kentucky border. Third of 11 children. From a very poor family. He, I think, got nothing more than a 3rd grade education, and he spends a lot of time working very hard, helping out the family, doing lots of manual labor and working on the farm, maybe even some blacksmithing, or maybe that was the dad, I forget. But also it's interesting, as a young man and into his 20s, he gets in a lot of trouble. He was a heavy drinker and got in lots of brawls and was arrested several times.
Yeah, that's one of the things that comes out a little bit in the film when it's hard to see Gary Cooper projecting a drinking and fighting guy from Tennessee, but he does. But what's
playing against type.
Yeah, what's so interesting about Sergeant York is that at least as far as all the contemporaries, and they were interviewed extensively in the 20s. We'll talk about in terms of his youth, his teenage years and his early 20s was that he's out drinking and brawling all the time, but he's also very religious, and he attends church religiously, so to speak. Sorry about that, and leads a church singing often. I mean, so he has this kind of tension in his life where he's on the one hand a rabble rouser, but then on the other hand, when Sunday rolls around, he's pious.
Right. In other words, there was already the foundation there for when he has his conversion experience, which is he attends a revival. Yeah, I guess he's about 27 years old at the time. He undergoes a conversion experience after going to a revival meeting at the end of 1914, and I think this was also partly to sort of appease his mother, who was, I think, appalled by his lifestyle. I'll put it that way. And so he basically becomes an extremely devout Christian, and it's a denomination which is, as I understand it, essentially pacifist.
Right.
Right, and that is an outgrowth of his understanding of Scripture.
Correct.
Right, and so he becomes...
Also, by the way,
faith becomes very important to him in his early 20s, and then he settles on a personal philosophy of pacifism.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Although I should also point out, and I think this maybe sometimes this gets exaggerated, but it is true that as someone in that sort of area of the country at that time, with living in sort of a large poor family, they did have a lot of experience hunting and killing their own food. So from all accounts, he was an expert marksman, and there's a reason for that. I think he had a lot of experience. Now, obviously, he had some talent, but a lot of experience early in his life with firearms.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. This is one of the most, as you said earlier, Phil, one of the most rural counties in Tennessee, and certainly one of the most rural places in the country.
Right. It seems like his father was an expert marksman, and his father trained him.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And obviously, this would become useful in his story in the Argonne Forest.
Sure.
And I think what's so fascinating as well is he's pushing 30 when the draft comes along.
Yeah.
In 1917, and
yeah,
they didn't want to draft people past 31. I think he's actually 29, but
right.
That seems to be he's had a lot of time to think about this kind of stuff, and so
sure.
he's the fact that he goes into the draft and then is willing to serve in the unit he serves in is fascinating.
Right. Well, it is all interesting when you compare it, for example, with subsequent drafts. Like, for example, during Vietnam, they were drafting 29-year-olds. Not even close. So I think maybe a lot of people were. I was really surprised to find they drafted basically everyone between 21 and 31. Well, everyone had to register. I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
A huge number, by the way, just parenthetically, a huge number of draftees were rejected because of poor health. I think it's something like 1 in 4. It's an enormous number were declared unfit for service in World War I. But he apparently was a sufficiently healthy 29-year-old, so they took him in. And when he registered for the draft, there was a question in the questionnaire: "Do you claim exemption from the draft?" And he wrote, "Yes, I don't want to fight." And I think there was some controversy later. I think maybe Joe, maybe you can correct me. I think later on he tried to sort of fudge the question of whether he had applied for conscientious objector status.
Well, I think it is fudged because there's exemption from the draft, but there's also, do you claim a conscientious exemption? And that didn't keep you out of the military. They could have, even in World War I, they could have put you in a hospital unit or something like that.
Right, exactly. Non-combat military service, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think he says something like, I don't want to fight, I believe in my Bible, and that's a big aspect of that conscientious objector statement.
Right. Well, let's also keep in mind this is during a war when there were more than a few Mennonites who refused any military service, whether combat or non-combat, and they were thrown in the penitentiary and treated brutally, including what amounted to torture. So this was a very serious issue.
Yeah, I think the reason we have this confusion about him not technically asking for conscientious objector status is later on in the 30s, and especially in the 40s, when he becomes much more militant personally, he says that he never did, even though he wrote the format that he did. So it's that's an aspect of his later life.
Right. But in any case, so he is drafted, and he's drafted and placed in Company G of the 328th Infantry Regiment, 82nd Infantry Division, stationed at Camp Gordon, Georgia. And then, it's my understanding, once again, Joe, maybe you can correct me, it's my understanding he's basically talked into the legitimacy of combat service by a couple of his superior officers.
Yeah, who also are devout Christians, very pious.
And this is while he's in the 82nd. The first...
Yeah, he's already in,
incarnation of the 82nd,
Yes, during the training period.
Right.
Partly by convincing him that it's not only in the Bible in appropriate places, but that this is a war, at least from the Allied standpoint, against an evil opposition. So
that's right.
There is something Christian and religious to it.
Exactly. There is all sorts of, for lack of a better term, righteous combat in the Bible, so they can use that. They can use that sort of analogy to reach him, and apparently quite effectively.
Yeah, and I've often wondered. I mean, and I have to stress because we try to point these things out on our show. This is pure speculation. Someone who's so good at hunting and is such a marksman, there must be some sort of itching to fire, to keep practicing that. And as pacifist as you might be, sort of morally, you've got to have some kind of itchy trigger finger to see how well you can do, and also how well you could please your superior officers if you're already that good.
Sure. Or from a different angle, it's like, okay, I've now been convinced this is a righteous war. Me, more than a lot of other people, should basically, there's pressure on me to use my skills for that cause. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I think that maybe that was.
I think that possibility gets lost in the discussions about York and what happened in Nice Argonne.
Right. Yep. I agree. So then his unit is stationed in France, and the 82nd Division takes part in what's called the Meuse-Argonne offensive. This is toward the end of the war. This is where the United States is really having sort of starting to play a major role in pushing the Germans back in northern France. This is where the Germans are going to surrender in November, and this is already October 1918. So it's just about a month before the war ends. But the United States really its weight is really being felt on the Western Front as American forces have built up. And so he's part of that offensive. And so then he's part of this small unit that's ordered to capture some German positions that are up on a ridge. And then they find out it's a very small force. It's about 17 soldiers, including some non-commissioned officers, including York, who had recently been promoted to corporal. But it's a very small unit, about 17 soldiers. It's not even a platoon, really. And they're ordered to take a ridge, or at least infiltrate a ridge, which is much more heavily armed and defended than they initially thought it was.
Yeah, and they lose, York would lose 9 guys more or less right away.
Yeah, exactly. They come under very, very heavy machine gun fire, and essentially half their unit is either killed or wounded, including, I think, everyone who was senior to him in that group of soldiers.
Yes,
so
that's right.
He is now he's now the senior, still intact soldier as a corporal, and he decides then to continue to lead. And I've read a few accounts. It's no matter how you slice it, and I guess we'll get to the controversy later, but how you slice it is pretty miraculous. Yeah. A lot of other people would have been killed attempting to do what he attempted to do, which is he's essentially out in the open. The Germans are up on a ridge in a trench, and he starts, as he described it, basically any time a German would show his head, what's the phrase he used? I'd touch them off. Yeah. In other words, he would basically kill them with headshots, one by one.
And he claimed later on that even though it was very, very loud and very confusing, and he was what he called sharpshooting, he kept yelling at them. He didn't want to kill any more than he had to.
Right.
So please stop firing on me, so I can either capture you on my own,
right,
or let's have, because I'm. He doesn't say this, but it's pretty obvious that he's saying, "Look, I'm an expert sharpshooter, and I'm going to get all of you eventually. But please don't make me."
Right. Well, and to put it another way, he also basically he's not 100% successful in suppressing his pacifist tendencies. Right.
No, that's right. Yeah.
He hasn't. Yeah, he's willing to take part in combat and in what he sees as his righteous cause, but he doesn't. It's not bloodlust, right? He doesn't. He doesn't go sort of super ninja and start killing as many people as he possibly can.
No, but go ahead. So what I've never understood, what's amazing to me is initially during the battle, the Germans are firing down from the ridge, down from the hill, but then York is able to get up towards, or at least close enough to the German trench that he's shooting at them in the trench. I don't know how to explain this horizontally, so to speak. So he must be working himself up in this sort of flat part through trees and big bushes and stuff to get up there. I mean, that is almost as amazing as the actual marksmanship.
Oh, absolutely. No, there were many opportunities where he easily could have been killed because he's under very heavy machine gun fire and not really under cover. But you're right. I mean, it is my impression he gets up basically into at least one of the German trenches, and then he can. Basically, the Germans are, in a line facing him, and so they can't bring as much fire to bear as they might otherwise because he can basically knock them off one by one, and each guy behind them in succession. But he also, there's this one moment, which I was also amazed to find out about, is where he at a certain point runs out of his Springfield rifle ammunition, and a group of 6 Germans from another area charge at him with their bayonets, and he kills all 6 of them with his handgun, with his .45 automatic, which is also miraculous.
Yeah, I think this is one thing perhaps we don't understand unless we've been in it, that also the chaos of battles,
Sure.
the chaos of small battles like this one, sometimes it works to a soldier's advantage. He must have been able to, the Germans must have thought there were 4 or 5 guys shooting at them.
Sure.
They
that has
charge
happened. That has happened in some other incidents in history. But also, I think what leads then to the really amazing thing is that there's the German officer in command, who's a lieutenant, apparently fires at him with his own handgun and misses every single shot. And I think that's when that German officer basically offers to surrender. Not only himself, but this entire, essentially company. Which is how, long story short, York and his 7 remaining men managed to march back to the American lines with 132 German prisoners. Now, that wasn't clear to me.
The proportion is amazing.
Oh my, yeah, exactly. I can only imagine what it would be like to be one of those 7 men worrying about what are these 132 guys going to do? Are they just going to keep their hands up and keep marching back? I've always wondered about that. These situations where the ratio of guard to prisoners is so poor.
Yeah, one of them could have had another handgun in his tunic and pulled it out and killed all 7 without
exactly. There have been many incidents that certainly happened in World War II all the time, where people acted like they were going to surrender and then didn't. That happened quite a bit, sort of a ruse. But and I guess later on in the early 2000s, when they investigated the actual area, they found a lot of the ammunition. Sort of spent bullets that confirmed this story, including the handgun bullets.
Including the German bullets, which I thought was really amazing. Can I just bust one quick myth,
Sure.
Colonel, before we go further?
Please.
And that is, there's the famous story of, him saying to his commander, York, I hear you captured the whole German army. And he says, no, I only got 132. Well, apparently that's true. But there's a myth about him saying, someone saying, oh, how did you do it? And he replied, I surrounded them. One guy surrounding 132. And that's the idea is that this kind of folksy humor, folksy wisdom, and which in a way is kind of what he did. He surrounded them. But there's no evidence that he said that part. It's a great line, but he didn't say it.
Right.
Right.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, well, it's certainly the sort of thing that adds to his story. Adds some flavor to his story, and really the way he's portrayed, certainly in the movie. His character.
I've always wondered what happened to the German lieutenant who surrendered his 132 guys to 7 of the enemy. Surely that's worthy of a court-martial.
Well, he must have gone to a British prisoner of war camp or a French one, so.
Right. No, like after the war, when all the German veterans are telling war stories. You think that one came up?
Well, I actually have his name, Paul Jürgen Vollmer.
Yep.
And maybe he changed his name when he got home. I don't know.
Right.
I'm sure his...
a negative medal, right? Like worst loss to the enemy.
I'm sure his career advancement was limited at that point.
Exactly. I wonder how he did in the interwar German army. Lord.
Yeah. Well, but the story, and you got, I don't know, Joe, you may know when the medals are, the order of the medals are given out and when they're given to him, but the story begins to sound too good to be true, more or less, in 1919. And I wonder at what stage, people start to say, well, this is unbelievable. They must have made it up in order to, either York made it up or the army made it up to boost morale, to show the heroic backwoodsmen.
Yeah, right. So there's a couple of things I cannot find the timing on this, but on which happened first. But both things happened in 1919. Okay. So people were looking at this with a skeptical eye and thinking that this could not have really happened this way. And simultaneously, some of the other soldiers in the 82nd in York's regiment said this did not happen this way, and they questioned the story. So somebody brought those two threads together, and I don't know if the impetus was the soldiers, the fellow soldiers, or the impetus was the skeptics on the outside looking at this, primarily in the state of New York. But those two things sort of culminated. And it's not 100% clear what the motivation of York's fellow soldiers were, other than that perhaps they just did not experience this the way he did, or they did not remember it, or their understanding of it was, they had a different understanding of it.
Right.
Well,
or if, I mean, rare... Go ahead, Joe.
What I am thinking is that, I mean, what I understand is that the doubt of, say, Corporal Cutting was one of York's, I guess, fellow corporals, and other people at the time who were there, is with the quote official version. Now that may be the version that's stated in the Medal of Honor citation, and maybe that got either overly summarized or York was overly heroicized in the citation. But the York story himself, I don't have any evidence that York's story himself was contradicted or doubted by the men who served with him.
Right.
I know that sounds like I'm splitting hairs, but I think it might be an important point to make. This doesn't seem to me to be that way.
Right. I get the impression that it's maybe more one of these things where York, in effect, is getting essentially 100% of the credit. Yeah. And so if you're one of the people who are with him, even if you recognize that he's primarily responsible, and maybe you think you got, and I know this is arbitrary, but maybe you deserve 10% of the credit, you're at pains to try and correct that story, right? It's like you're going to resent, even if he is the lead figure, you're going to resent the idea that he did this all alone, and that you're getting absolutely no recognition, and he's getting a ton.
Yeah, so in a way, we're both saying that it may be that the corporals, the non-commissioned officers who served with him, who went on the record, so to speak, in doubting him, or doubting the story, are not doubting York. You know, they're sort of like, hey, we were in this together, and the different stories turned it into a single hero.
Exactly. In fact, I thought it was interesting, even to backtrack it a little bit, I thought it was interesting that the story, considering how amazing it is, does not immediately become a story. For example, he's initially awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, and then only later, when they look at it again, do they sort of upgrade it to the Medal of Honor. And then it starts to snowball, and he gets medals from he gets the Croix de Guerre from the French. Ferdinand Foch, who was the supreme Allied commander, apparently said, quote, to York, what you did was the greatest thing accomplished by any soldier in all the armies of Europe, which is pretty high praise. Considering how much combat there had been. Yeah. But then the press doesn't get a hold of it until the following year, not until the Saturday Evening Post has a big article in April 1919. That's months later, and that's months after the war is over. So I guess people should. It's an early information age, right? It takes time for this stuff to percolate. He doesn't, go on Instagram and tell everyone about his story.
Hashtag surrender, hashtag captured all of the German army. But also, I think that one of the things, it's very important what you said about Saturday Evening Post, and that is that, the Saturday Evening Post was read by everybody. It was the one magazine that everybody got. It was the one magazine that was in doctors' waiting rooms. The one magazine that was, way beyond what Time and Newsweek have. And they even report, the newspapers report not only when Sergeant York proposes to his girlfriend, but later when she says yes. There's like this sort of telegraph in Tennessee, giving a play-by-play of Sergeant York's life when he gets home after the Saturday Evening Post story comes out.
Right. I'm going to assume, and I think I'm on pretty good ground here, I'm also going to assume that partly what's going on is very quickly a lot of Americans are disillusioned by the war. The war didn't turn out the way they thought it was going to be, or it didn't turn out the way they were told it was going to be, right? This war to end all wars, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm assuming that a lot of Americans were more eager than usual to latch on to sort of a feel-good story.
Yeah.
In other words, to something like a positive story about an American related to the war. I'm assuming that could only have helped this story sort of mushroom into him becoming not just a hero, but a celebrity.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
And then, of course, his personal story, his personal journey. He was obviously a likable figure. He'd come through
Sure.
this sort of moral journey, this moral questioning of the war, and then he'd come through the other side of it. He was a symbol in some ways of American purity, of American innocence. And so all these things are sort of bubbling under the surface in 1919, and then they all made him something that transcended the American soldier. They made him a figure that was beyond that of the American soldier.
That's right. And also remember, the 1920s and 30s, these are I would argue, the first decades of modern American celebrity. Because of modern media, because of radio, because of newsreels, because of magazines like the Saturday Evening Post. Remember, it's just a few years later where Charles Lindbergh becomes just this incredible phenomenon. So in that sense, I mean, not that this is necessarily entirely a good thing for York, but his timing is good in terms of him becoming sort of a sort of celebrity phenomenon.
Right.
Yeah, but also it's important to remember that one of the things York did was not cash in when he got
Right.
home, and this must have been a terribly difficult thing to refuse. But he was offered product endorsements and movie rights early on in the 20s.
Right,
And
vaudeville tours.
Yeah, he would only give his name to charitable causes. So that's a pretty big thing. And I mean, there must be people who do it now, but someone to come from very rural Tennessee to go to France, landing in Paris, and then going out and fighting Germany, experiencing an entirely different world, and then coming home and being offered all these things and having the moral backbone to turn them down is really very impressive.
Oh, sure. Well, this is the man who had, at my understanding, he had essentially never left his county until he went to war.
Yeah.
So his world becomes much broader. And in a way, I mean, just adding on to what you were saying, the one thing he did accept was a farm that was sort of the Nashville Rotary raised his money, gave him a farm, and that ended up costing him because he didn't get the resources to help sort of develop and maintain the farm, and it became this sort of it became this sort of economic burden on him. So it not only did he not cash in, but in a way he was sort of unlucky in the very little cashing in that he did.
Well, part of the problem for him, this much is clear from those around him at the time, is that he was, even after he returned, he was conflicted about his role in this. And so he regretted, in some ways he regretted participating in the war. He regretted his actions in the forest that day. And he certainly felt that in a biblical sense, that the worst thing he could have done was to get some sort of earthly acclaim for killing other people.
Exactly.
Okay.
Also, by the way, do either of you happen to know, I mean, I've seen different figures, how many Germans he allegedly killed? It was more than 20 is what I've read in that one action, and in addition to all those that he captured.
Yeah.
So I thought it was about 20. But that's a funny thing. I didn't look up that specific number. That's interesting. Mm-hmm.
There's a few different numbers that we've seen in the Douglas Mastriano account, which we've had him on the show here. He is I'm not sure if he's considered the definitive story, the final word on this, but I know that he's toured the country and published a book on this. So by his account, it's 21.
21? Okay.
Wow. Yeah. And
I mean, amazing no matter what it is,
but to do it with what type of rifle was that he was using? It wasn't necessarily, was it a bolt-action rifle? Was it
it's a bolt-action. I'm pretty sure it's the standard issue Springfield 03, which is bolt-action and has an internal stripper clip with 5 rounds, I believe.
Okay, well, you technical guys know more than I do. What does that mean in plain English? What is
he has to not nearly as quickly as today. Basically, he has to work the bolt for every shot he fires. And then after he's fired 5 shots, he has to open the bullet and insert another stripper clip with 5 rounds. So
this is at least a second or two between shots.
Oh, yeah. No, his rate of fire is incredibly slow by today's standards.
Wow, which makes it even more fantastic.
Oh, yeah. Well, and also just the circumstances are horrible for him sort of showcasing his expert marksmanship, and yet still he pulls it off.
Wow. Well, you mentioned the Mastriano study a few minutes ago, Joe, and I was wondering if I could talk a little bit about that, because this is what I got very excited about this, because it's something that I think is not only fascinating, but reflects the fact that scholarship and examination and investigation of things like this, continue. It isn't we just don't leave things where they are.
Right.
In other words, can I tell the archaeology story?
Please.
Go ahead.
Well, there had, of course, been these doubts, as we've been saying, in the 1920s and 1930s about what actually happened, and then I suppose as World War II came along, people sort of forgot about it. Maybe even after the movie came out, people sort of said, well, it's a movie. And there were as far as I know, two archaeological expeditions to find out if they could find actual evidence of what happened. And I would think what your listeners might think, and certainly what my listeners think, is that archaeology is sort of ancient Egypt and things that Indiana Jones would look into. But what we remember is this is 100 years ago, and so an historian can't examine these things. You need someone. You need archaeology. And the first, there was an earlier project, right, that had attempted to find out, first of all, where this was, where York was standing, where he was firing, where the trench was, and got it.
Which, by the way, can I just interject? That's an enormous problem on its own. I mean,
yeah, because the land has changed.
Pinpointing the location is extremely difficult.
Yeah, and after all, presumably this is private land, and someone has either refarmed it or changed it, or even the trees and the tree line, all that stuff has changed, and that's why I keep stressing this point that it's a really long time ago, and that's why we need these different tools, archaeological tools.
Or people have already combed the area with metal detectors, like souvenir hunters. I mean, there's so many things that can sort of degrade the site.
Yeah, and so it didn't help it certainly helped the criticism of the story that the first modern 21st century, if you will, examination of the site said of the area, I should say, got the site wrong by 500 or 600 yards, and then only 10 years ago, 2006, the Mastriano expedition went out and found where it really was, and not only did they find where York was really standing when he did all of it, they found all these rifle rounds and all these, I suppose, ejected cartridges from the rifle, and then also from his handgun, more or less exactly where they were supposed to be. And not only that, they were able to take those rounds and other rounds that they found in the area where the German trench was, and all that kind of stuff, and and submit them to forensic examination and determine that, yes, they came from York's rifle, yes, they came from his pistol, yes, these German rounds we found come from the German weapons of the time, and so confirmed through archaeology that...
So does this mean they still had York's original weapons so they could compare the ballistics? Because if that's true, that's also an amazing part of the story.
Yeah, because you would think that he would turn his weapon in more or less after the war was over. I mean, I don't know how. Maybe they're allowed to keep them and whatnot, but those things were able to be determined, conclusively.
Right.
And it's a fascinating example of late 20th century, early 21st century archaeology.
Exactly. And it really doesn't, this sort of physical confirmation of a story, really this is about as good as it gets. This is, I mean, it might be, this is sort of the gold standard for confirming, what is otherwise oral history and people telling stories.
Yeah, I think the story of how this came to pass and how this evidence was obtained is almost just as compelling as the initial story of what happened in the forest, in that, the team spent more than 10 years looking at this stuff, and they didn't, what they did was, in addition to the archaeological evidence, they put that together with the tactics of the German forces in this kind of terrain back in 1918. And they also retraced the diaries of the American soldiers, and they retraced the diaries of the German soldiers, and they were able to, putting all those little pieces together, they were able to, they feel, conclusively determine what happened there. I think there's some skeptics that remain. So there's some folks that think that the archaeological dig may have gone on the wrong hilltop. But in terms of closing this out as an issue, for the most part, this is closed as a historical fact.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, these things have been not only peer-reviewed in the first place before they were published, but it turned, they have been re-examined by other experts trying to find out, trying to refine the story. I mean, scholarship is something, is a bit of a battle in its own sense. Someone makes a claim, backs it up with evidence, then someone says, oh, wait a minute, I don't know about that, and then tries to examine the evidence, and it's a continual thing. It's like a scientific battle. Right. And it's also very, very important.
Yeah. It's as they say, it's an argument without end. But also in this case, I mean, that's, the context, the amount of effort devoted to this one case was extraordinary.
That's right. We know more about this than any other.
Oh, absolutely. And, this really does take a lot of effort and a lot of resources. And, in other words, this could not be used on a routine basis in other lesser-known historical events. It's just too expensive. There's not enough hours and enough personnel and enough money to do it. But in this case, I mean, it really is amazing what you can do when you have those sorts of resources.
And the other thing about this, the if you will, 21st century part of this story that impressed me so much, and this is also harkens back to the French Legion of Honor, is that the French are as celebratory, almost as celebratory of Sergeant York as the Americans. I mean, yes, there isn't a French movie, Sergeant York, but they put monuments at the site. They've made a historical trail at the site where you can go and look at all these things, and that's a pretty big thing to do 100 years after it happened by a foreigner. You know what I mean? Sure. There's an American guy there. They didn't necessarily do it for all the French sharpshooters in different parts of the.
Wait, so you're saying that? So in other words, it's not just Jerry Lewis that the French are fascinated with?
Yeah, no, there is a Sergeant York mania in France.
Maybe not on the same scale.
And it seems to be very serious, and it's very, 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 very important. And I was very impressed, and maybe I'm easy.
Well, and there are markers at the site currently, isn't that the case?
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Okay. So you can. I mean, they're probably not selling Sergeant York bobblehead dolls, but you can go there as a sort of historical tourist.
And again, one of the things that Europeans impressed me so much with the seriousness with which they take World War I, and World War I especially, events and sites. And, those things are treated very, very, almost reverentially.
Oh, yeah. Look at the pictures of some of
the gift shop in the nearest town, but there won't be a gift shop right there at the
Correct. No, you're right. I was being flip, of course.
No, of course.
But also some of those cemeteries, as you can see pictures of them online, they are immaculately kept, including cemeteries where Americans are buried, of course. I think Arlington gets a lot of attention for good reason, but let's remember there are a lot of Americans buried in Europe as well.
Yeah. So
like George Patton, for example, who's buried in Luxembourg.
Well, that's the end of my archaeology, Indiana Jones, 21st century Sergeant York story.
No, but it is a really important point. You're absolutely right. The image of archaeology is sort of pottery shards.
Yeah.
But it is an ongoing and modern technique as well.
Yeah, good. All right, look, I think this closes out our discussion about Alvin York. I think it's a very rich story, obviously.
Absolutely.
And it remains part of our all-American legacy.
Yes, it certainly does.
All right. Yep. So parting words from Doctors Coohill and Nash.
I think that one of the things we're trying to get across here is that maybe it's something that because it's such a good story, and because there's so much of the story is absolutely true, evidence-wise, it's something that students should look into and continue to look into. I want to hear more about Sergeant York, as the decades go on.
Right, and I agree totally, and I would just add that continuing to look into it and continuing even to look into the claims of other people is no disrespect for Alvin York. In other words, if we can in any way improve the accuracy of our understanding of the story, that is nothing against him. In fact, I'd argue that's a tribute to him.
Right.
Absolutely a tribute to him.
Great. Thanks for joining me.
Well, it's been great.
My pleasure.